The Redlands Bust is the most famous drug bust in the history of rock and
Keith
roll. And Mick was set up. The news of the world tipped off the police, but who tipped off the news of the world? Who was on the phone? Who plunged the dagger in the back of Mick Jagger? Who rolled on the stones?
67 was a year of change for everybody.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
It's Saturday, 11th February 1967. Let's Spend the Night Together is number 4 in the charts. A phone is ringing at the news of the world. The sub-editor on the news desk puts his fag in the ashtray and picks up the phone. Someone, no one knows who, has a story. Keith Richards is having a party at his 13th century Redlands estate in Suffolk. Mick Jagger is there, and there are drugs. Mick and Keith are taking acid, and they're going to be sent to prison. It's time to wax our moustaches and go all a bit Miss Marple. In the face of overwhelming odds, we have only one option. You and me are gonna Agatha Christie the shit out of this. This is part 1. We're gonna look at the suspects. In part 2, we'll look at the trial. In part 3, I will reveal for the very first time just who ratted out the Rolling Stones. This whodunit begins on Friday the 3rd of February 1967, 9 days before the Redlands Bust. A reporter for the News of the World is working undercover. He's been told to get salacious stories, anything that connects pop stars to drugs. He's in the exclusive London nightclub Blazes. It's cramped, noisy, sweaty and filled with musicians, agents, managers, writers, all getting drunk and swapping industry gossip. Jimi Hendrix played here only a few weeks ago. It's the perfect place to dig for dirt on the stars of rock and pop. Sunday, 5th of February, 7 days before the Redlands Bust. The News of the World publishes a story with the headline, Pop Stars and Drugs, Facts That Will Shock You. It's a puritanical and sensational expose guaranteed to shock, titillate and sell newspapers. And boy, does it ever. 9 million copies of the paper are bought that Sunday. The article says Mick Jagger was in the club taking LSD and flashing a large lump of cannabis, inviting girls to come smoke it with him in his flat. But it wasn't Mick. It was Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones, who was flaunting his drugs. Mick Jagger reads the story. This could be the end of his career. It could affect record sales. He could get arrested. He could be refused a visa and stop touring in the USA. Moreover, it isn't true. He's got an alibi. Tuesday, 11th of February, 5 days before the Redlands Bust, Mick Jagger issues a writ for libel. It's true. Mick Jagger sued a red top on a Tuesday when the Rolling Stones was topping the charts with Ruby Tuesday. The newspaper lied. Mick Jagger wasn't in the club and he can prove it. The News of the World has libelled Mick Jagger. They're going to lose and damages will be substantial. The editor of the News of the World was Stafford Summerfield, a Fleet Street legend. He has to do something. A drugs conviction would scupper Jagger's libel case. He needs a story to discredit Mick. And quick. Saturday, 11th of February, 1 day before the Redlands Bust. The party is being held in honour of Mick Jagger. At Redlands, he's going to have his very first acid trip. At midday, everyone drops acid and the party gets started. Guests include Beatle George Harrison, movie star Dennis Hopper, Beat Generation author William Burroughs, Stones manager Andrew Oldham, and a host of hangers-on. 12th of February 1967. This is it. This is the Redlands Bust. It's Sunday night. 7:30. There's a knock at the door. Keith Richards looks out the window and he's still tripping. He sees uniformed dwarves at the door. And he welcomes them in.
I love this. I love this.
But it's not 7 dwarves, it's 18 police officers. The police are a bit late. Jagger and Richards are 23 years old? And they've done all the drugs. What the police find is a bunch of young English rock stars quietly listening to music and tripping. Guess what they were listening to when the police arrived? Bob Dylan's Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35. Mick Jagger is on the sofa with Marianne Faithfull. She'd had a quick shower and covered herself with a fur rug. Everyone's still high. They giggle as the police sees sticks of incense, ashtrays, joss sticks, no Mars bars. That's just a rumour put about by some cunning linguist. The police search Mick and in his coat they find 4 pet pills. Art dealer Robert Fraser, Groovy Bob, has a small amount of heroin. Jagger and Groovy Bob are arrested for possession. Keith Richards is arrested for allowing his house to be used for the purpose of smoking cannabis. So, who's the rat that tipped off the paper? Jagger and Richards are pretty paranoid. It's hardly surprising. They're off their heads. They're young. They're under arrest. They're suspicious of everyone. The sticky finger of blame first points at harmless hippie Nicky Kramer. He's a penniless upper-class hanger-on who was so high on acid he never came down. He's an amiable loon, flowers in his hair, a bell round his neck, blowing bubbles. Shockingly, someone, probably Keith, has him hung out of the window by his ankles, but Kramer doesn't confess. Keith Richards thought his Belgian chauffeur Patrick had sold them out, so he sacked him right away. In a way, he was right, as Patrick did sell his story to the news of the world. Someone, probably Keith, had him beaten up too. But was Patrick really the snitch? The next suspect is David Snyderman, the acid king. He was at the party supplying acid from his stash in a briefcase, but he claims his briefcase wasn't searched. The very next day, the acid king flees the country. Did he tip off the news of the world? In later years, he claims MI5 and the CIA had got him to set up the Rolling Stones in return for dropping a drug smuggling case. Is that case closed? Next up, Rolling Stones manager Andrew Oldham. He claims he's terrified of being arrested and flees to the USA. As a result, he's sacked. Did he make the call to destroy his own band? Alan Klein became the new manager. Did Klein set up the Stones to discredit Andrew Oldham? Over the years, that sticky finger of suspicion has pointed at Keith's bodyguard, an ex-paratrooper called Tom Keylock. Why? Because his brother works for the Metropolitan Police. Things rapidly spiral out of control. The band flees the country to avoid the press. They're nearly arrested in Paris for not paying a hotel bill. The police are called in Spain when they can't pay a restaurant bill. Brian Jones is being erratic, coughing non-stop, driving everyone crazy. In Tangier, Brian Jones discovers his girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, is leaving him for Keith Richards. The band abandoned Brian Jones, leaving him in the hotel alone, lovelorn, and penniless. Jagger certainly blames Brian Jones. If he hadn't been bragging in a London nightclub, none of this would ever have happened. Brian Jones wasn't at the party. Did Brian Jones suspect Keith was having an affair with Anita? Did he make that call? You can let me know in the comments which of the suspects you think did it. The newspaper editor, the chauffeur, the hippie, the dealer with a briefcase full of drugs, the ambitious American music manager, the disgruntled pop star, the crooked cop, the bodyguard, or the whole British establishment. And don't forget to tell me your favourite top 3 Rolling Stones songs. In part 2, we're going to take a look at the trials. Are there any clues in the transcripts? See you next time. Murder! It's just a shot away! It's just a shot away! It's Thursday, 22nd of June. Jagger and Keith Richards are at the West Sussex Quarter Sessions in Chichester. Before His Honour, Judge Block and a jury. Jagger's in court for possession of 4 pet pills and Richards for allowing his house to be used for the smoking of cannabis. Ray! They plead not guilty. The trials, they're a farce. Murder! Welcome back. In part 1 we lined up the suspects. Who ratted out the Rolling Stones? In part 2 we're looking at the trials. Were there any clues in the court transcripts? Was it an establishment stitch-up? The entire British establishment!
Running for the shelter of a mother's little helper and to help her.
2 trials in just 2 days. Jagger's is all over by 3 o'clock. Jagger explains to the court he normally gets mother's little helpers on prescription, but he was in Italy and he bought some. They're legal there. They were in his coat pocket and he'd simply forgotten that he had them.
Doctor, please, some more of these.
His doctor takes the stand and says yes, he normally prescribes them. The pills aren't dangerous, just mild pet pills. The prosecutor, Anthony McCowan QC, doesn't challenge the doctor at all. They break for lunch and Mick orders a prawn cocktail, roast lamb with mint sauce, fresh strawberries and cream and a bottle of Beaujolais. It costs 10 bob. He's relaxed. The defence are relaxed. It's a very small amount of pet pills. It's not a big deal. So they come back from lunch and there's closing arguments from both sides. The judge goes through some legal issues and then he addresses the jury. He explains to the jury that Mick Jagger has no defence. The jury should find him guilty. So they do. The next day, Keith Richards is on trial. The only evidence is a minute scraping of cannabis resin taken from an ashtray and 3 roaches. That's it. Detective Inspector Lynch testifies that where you find incense and joss sticks, you find people smoking cannabis. Detective Sergeant Cudmore says he thought Jagger was wearing makeup. PC Evelyn Fuller says she entered the house and noticed an unusual smell. She saw pink ostrich feathers on the bed, books on witchcraft, black velvet trousers, a sombrero and a pair of purple boots. She says Marianne Faithfull appeared to be in a very merry mood.
Evidence that an unnamed naked woman was sitting on a sofa with a rug around her when police raided Keith Richards' house at West Wittering was given in court today.
PC Fuller tells the court that when they tried to search Marianne Faithfull, she let the rug fall from her shoulders to the floor. Stark bollock naked, she giggled, "Look, they want to search me," making Jagger burst into peals of laughter. That's it. That's all the evidence they had. Rape! Murder! It's just a shot away! Basically, the prosecution have no evidence. Instead, they're trying to jock the jury and the judge. Rape! Murder! It's just a shot away. It's just a shot away. But it's working. Marianne Faithfull, for her part, was brilliant. In the court and in the press, she was only referred to as Miss X to preserve her dignity. But she came to court every day, radiant, dressed to the nines and smiling broadly at the cameramen, the assembled press and the jury. Everyone knew who Miss X was and everyone could see she was in no way embarrassed. She was wonderful.
I had no idea the establishment could come down on you like that. I really didn't. None of us did.
Keith Richards is defiant in court. He's asked over and over about Marianne Faithfull and why she was uninhibited, naked in a house with 8 men. It could only be, surely, because she was smoking cannabis. Keith Richards is so cool. He says, "I'm not a man who's bothered by petty morality." Of course, he's found guilty too. On June the 29th, they're sentenced. Jagger gets a £200 fine and 3 months in prison. Richard gets a £500 and 1 year in prison. Those are very, very, very steep sentences.
Took the jury only an hour this afternoon to bring in a verdict of guilty, and now Keith Richards and Mick Jagger are waiting to be taken to prison.
Mick Jagger is sent to Brixton Prison and Keith to Wormwood Scrubs. Jagger looks shocked as he's taken down.
There was a dead silence as the judge added, "You will go to prison for 1 year." And Richard, who earlier had talked in his evidence of what he called petty morals, went down to the cells without expression.
The public are outraged. The police, the courts and the press have gone too far. It's widely seen as the technicoloured flowering of youth culture versus the stodgy, old, grey, establishment. Thousands gather in Piccadilly Circus and the police set the dogs on them. John Peel plays the Stones for a whole hour on his show. Pirate Radio Caroline plays the Stones for 24 hours non-stop. In New York, there are demonstrations outside the British Embassy. There was a campaign to send flowers to the judge. Shops on Carnaby Street sell handcuffs labelled "Be Faithful" with a pair of Jagger links. And the world of rock and pop comes to their defence too. Jimi Hendrix voices support, saying a cat is human too. On the 30th of June 1967, The Who released 2 Rolling Stones covers, The Last Time and Under My Thumb, as a way of supporting the band.
Under my thumb, the girl who once had me down. I told you once and I told you twice.
Groovy Bob got 1 year in prison. He didn't appeal and served 6 months. Keith and Mick did appeal. They were released. They only spent 1 night in prison. That very same day, crooked cop Norman Pilcher arrests Brian Jones. It was a newspaper that got them into trouble, and maybe it was a newspaper that got them off. On the 1st of July, Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, William, the editor of the Times, writes a scathing editorial with the headline, "Who breaks a butterfly on a wheel?" In it, he criticises the very harsh sentences. He writes it's unfair. Jagger is the butterfly and British justice is the wheel of torture. On the 31st of July, Lord Chief Justice Lord Parker agrees and says there's no evidence Jagger was dealing pills. It's a minor offence. The sentence is absurd. He reduces Jagger's sentence to a conditional discharge. Turning to Keith's trial, Lord Parker rules that being in a very merry mood is not proper evidence that anybody smoked cannabis. The prosecution spent way too much time discussing Marianne Faithfull wearing only a bearskin rug. It was prejudicial to the case. The conviction was unsafe. Keith goes free too.
Something happened to me yesterday.
On the 18th of August 1967, the Rolling Stones released We Love You. Lennon-McCartney on backing vocals. It's a thank you to everyone for all the support. Good song too, and a cheeky video depicting the band as Oscar Wilde. That really upset William Rees-Mogg. He didn't like it at all. So was it the establishment stitching up rich kid upstarts who had it coming to them? Why were they found guilty on such flimsy evidence in the first place? The vital clue isn't in the court transcripts. It's in an after-dinner speech given by His Honour Judge Block just after the trial, in which he said, "Of course, I've rolled a few stones recently. Ha bloody ha." The judge knew he was wrong. He was grandstanding. He was playing to the gallery. But he had little choice. It's a fault in our judicial system. Once a case is in the paper, once the public is watching, the judge has little choice but to impose a harsh sentence to set an example. And of course he knew he'd be appealed, but it's far better for a judge to be appealed by the defence than the prosecution. That's just the way it is. It happens all the time. It's not right, it's not fair, but there it is. In part 3, I will reveal for the very first time who snitched on the Rolling Stones. I'm going to tell you who done it. Let me know in the comments which of the suspects you think did it. The newspaper editor, the chauffeur, the hippie, the dealer with a briefcase full of drugs, the ambitious American music manager, the disgruntled pop star, the crooked cops, the bodyguard, or the entire British establishment. Oh, and don't forget to tell me your top 3 Rolling Stones songs. See you next time. Which of the suspects? What's a suspect? Let's spend the night together. Who writes this rubbish?
Would you welcome please the Rolling Stones?
Making a video. Make YouTube videos about law.
Well, I told you once and I told you twice.
Law. This one's about the Redlands Bust. Law. The Rolling Stones were arrested in '67 and sent to prison. They were rather stitched up by an angry judge. And it's a very, very, very silly trial. Have a good walk, won't you? Welcome back. This is part 3. This will be the last time. Who ratted out the Rolling Stones? In part 1, we gathered all the suspects. In part 2, we examined the trial, looking for clues. In this concluding chapter, I will reveal for the very first time the identity of the rat think telltale who got Mick and Keith banged up for a crime that they did commit and did kind of get away with.
It's against the law, you know, and I think looking back on it, it seems rather a barbaric law.
Someone will have to pay the price.
So who done it? Who made that call to the news desk of the News of the World? Who was the snitch? The newspaper editor, the chauffeur, the hippie, the dealer with a briefcase full of drugs, the ambitious American music manager, the disgruntled pop star, the crooked cops, the bodyguard, or the entire British establishment? Tell me in the comments and then watch the rest of the show, and don't forget to tell me your top 3 Stones album. Get ready for the big reveal. Let's start it up. It's time to get some satisfaction. Here we go. The hangers-on, the chauffeur and the bodyguard didn't betray the Stones. The papers would pay for tip-offs, but you don't bite the hand that feeds you.
Oh no. Oh no.
And sure, Alan Klein wanted Andrew Oldham's clients, but the last thing he wanted was a drugs bust. The dealer at the party, the Acid King, lied about what happened years later. His briefcase was searched and it was empty. How do I know that? Because the kids at the party had done all the drugs. He fled. Oldham fled because they were scared, not because they were snitches.
Oh no.
The British establishment didn't really give a damn about a bunch of rock stars. Jagger and Richards were represented in court by actor Nigel Havers' dad, Michael Havers. He was the most expensive silk in the country. He ended up the Attorney General under Margaret Thatcher, and then the Lord Chancellor, and then a baron in the House of Lords. He was the very embodiment of the British establishment. If the establishment did anything, it conspired to get Jagger and Richards off the charges. You don't get more establishment than Lord Rees-Mogg, editor of The Times. That editorial was only voicing public opinion. There was no conspiracy by the establishment.
Here's a chance to change your mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, I told you this was an Agatha Christie mystery. This is the twist. On Murder on the Orient Express, it was all of them. In the Redlands Bust, it was none of them. The Redlands Bust wasn't caused by a phone call to the News of the World. There never was a phone call. There was no informant, but there was a snitch. There was a no-good, down and dirty rat who conspired to arrest Mick and Keith. The News of the World dealt in lies, checkbook journalism. They interfered in criminal trials. They bribed cops for tip-offs. They did it for decades. They traded in gossip and scandal. The News of the World simply lied. That rag was eventually closed down for hacking the phones of celebrities. There was no phone call. The News of the World wanted to undermine Mick Jagger's libel case. That scurrilous newspaper had him followed. They knew he was at Redlands for a party. It didn't take a genius to work out that Redlands would be awash with narcotics. The police in this country are lazy and slow. They arrived a day late. Jagger and Richards were lucky to only have been caught with a very small amount of drugs. The News of the World tipped off the police. So who was the snitch? Who was the rat? That person was none other than the editor of the News of the World, Stafford Summerfield. The editor of the News of the World, Stafford Summerfield, the Fleet Street legend who invented checkbook journalism. He probably didn't make the call to the police himself, but the call was made with his full knowledge and his full approval. But the Stones were stoners. Over the next years and decades, they would all be arrested for drugs over and over. The arrests were inevitable. If not at Redlands, then soon. I've told you once, I've told you twice, this would not be the last time. Oh no, oh no. Did the Redlands Bust matter? Not really. It didn't affect the history of the world. It didn't change English law. I know it's only rock and roll, but I like it. I like it. Yes, I do. But it had an undeniably massive effect on the history of the Rolling Stones. It created a bond between Mick and Keith, which led to the sacking of Andrew Oldham and Brian Jones. Redlands changed the band. In January '69, before the bust, they released a not very good pop album, Between the Buttons. In December '69, they released a not very good psychedelic album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. It was recorded between the bust and the appeal, but after Redlands, after the appeal, they were a different group. They turned their backs on pop and started to find the voice, the swagger, the attitude that would make them the greatest rock and roll band in the world. They were free to do whatever they wanted to do. No fear. What followed Redlands was Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street. Redlands could have been the breaking of the Stones. Instead, it was the making of the Stones. They weren't broken on the wheel like a butterfly. They were the wheel, a steel wheel. Redlands wasn't even bad news for the Stones. Redlands won them new fans and credibility and solidified their image as the bad boys of rock. That master of PR, Alan Klein, spun the Redlands Bust to cast the Stones as the most dangerous band in the world, as Keith Richards readily admits. I've been playing up to it ever since.
I saw some guy heading straight for Mick. I have no idea what this guy's going to do. I don't know if he's going to stab Mick, hug him, kiss him, roll over and screw him. I don't know. And I do have a weapon in my hand. That Telecaster's a real handy smack on him. And I just took it off and I saw that he was definitely going for Mick and nobody else was going to get in the way, so I just swung it. He fell into Charlie's drum kit, but didn't stop Charlie playing, you know. By then the guys had grabbed him, so I put the guitar back on. I was playing Satisfaction at the time. And this is going to sound terrible, but the damn thing had stayed in tune.
Would you welcome